Professor Mathew, thanks for taking the time to speak with us again.
My pleasure.
Yesterday, you spoke to us about a rights-based approach that can help in enacting better laws, and we wanted to talk with you specifically today about education, because a big theory in the middle class is that if you solve primary education, the country will inevitably reap the fruits of that effort. Where do you think previous governments have failed, and where do you think our lawmaking is lacking?
First of all, I agree with the idea that if there is universalization of school education, it will be a major step in the direction of moving towards equity and our constitutional goals. Other countries in the world which have done so have already proved that such is the result. So I accept that proposition. And in India, I am happy to say that as a result of people's efforts, civil society organizations, hundreds of them, they have been clamoring for the right to education. It is they who have pointed out to the country that if you want to address the question of child labor, you can't do it unless you address the question of universalization of school children. A child who is not in school is a potential child laborer. But the task that the middle class must particularly take note of is, so far as the middle class is concerned, we already have good quality education in our country. There are educational institutions which are world class and we can compete with anybody. But there's a huge segment of our population and it's grossly underestimated generally. 60 to 70% of our population, they are really the poor, they are marginalized, they are excluded. And so far as they are concerned, they have no access to private educational institutions. In this context, the only solution is that the government schools must be made to function.
How do you address that though on the supply side? Because right now the infrastructure is desperately lacking. The government of the day has tried to address that by saying that let private schools also step up and play a role in catering to the underclasses. Is that not the approach that is needed in the short term?
Well, this is a constitutional goal which is as old as the directive principles. Article 45 had said that all children should receive free and compulsory primary education in 10 years' time. This is the only directive principle which has a time limit upon it. And yet that was never achieved and it was, had to be postponed again and again. It's in that context that people started asking for this right, in a more determined manner. And the first step that took place in this direction was the Supreme Court's intervention. In fact, if you look at this aspect of it, then it's a huge contribution to the human rights jurisprudence at a world level. I say that because generally education is considered to be part of economic, social and cultural rights. These are rights which are in the distant future. They have to be progressively realized in international jurisprudence. Whereas, and it was so far as directive principles are concerned, it belongs to that part of the Constitution which is to be progressively realized. But the Supreme Court read Article 21 and then pointed out that we are now going to say to the world that that right to education is part of right to life. And that is so because if you want to lead a dignified life, then you must consider education to be the prerequisite for such dignity.
But isn't it true that now Parliament has actually introduced that into the Constitution as well?
Yes, post the Supreme Court judgment, that the Parliament has come in and introduced Section 21A. In fact, it was done as early as the BJP government. Murli Manohar Joshi was the minister at that time. But there was an interesting mischief while 21A was introduced, and that mischief is perhaps this is the only fundamental right in the Constitution which is subject to the statute. As we all know, all statutory law is subject to the Constitution. Here is a situation where Article 21 says that, educational right will be as may be prescribed by law. So here you have a strange situation where statutory law almost supersedes the fundamental right.
So what is wrong in the law that has eventually been enacted to further that right?
Well, finally you have to find out how do you provide for the infrastructure and the human resource. By infrastructure, I mean there must be enough classrooms. It's not as if the government doesn't know how to do it. If you look at the Kendriya Vidyalayas, they are run excellently. People generally believe that only the private institutions can run education well. Kendriya Vidyalaya proves the opposite. It has shown that a government institution can function. What do? You have enough classrooms. One classroom per class is the minimum. One teacher per class is the minimum. And in addition to that, you must have drinking water, you must have toilets for girl children. One reason why girl children stop going to school in different parts of India, rural India, is because those minimum facilities are not present. And so once their primary education is over, they don't even get into elementary, forget secondary.
So how do you ensure that funds are made available for these exercises? Because governments are cash strapped.
Yes, but this is a kind of, when it comes to the basic needs are basic entitlements. If you want to build a new future for this country, there are some minimum inputs that have to be provided. And education is the most fundamental among them. And so there is no question of saying that we cannot provide education to all our children because there's a budgetary deficit. Make it the first charge on your budget. You must make sure that all other expenditure is subordinate to this. And so in that sense, it's a question of rearranging budgetary priorities and making the money available. But mind you, very often even when the money is allocated, the state governments have not utilized that money. And that is for two reasons. One is there's not enough political will. And if there is no political will, then that's a situation in which there is a lot of corruption also which moves in.
So what would be the short-term solution that you have in mind?
I think, while generally speaking, I welcome the right to education law, we must remember that in every state there's also another law, and that is the Grant in Aid Code related law. The Grant in Aid Code is a mechanism by which the government gives a certain aid to the private institution and stipulates what kind of regulation. I am one of those, and I know that this is not a popular opinion, but I don't hesitate to say it. I think the right to education law should not have gone into the regulation of private institutions. They should have left that to the other statute. It's not as if that part of the job should not be done. But by bringing that into this legislative framework, you can see now people going to the Supreme Court, asking a number of questions. So the entire focus has shifted to a legal battle, litigation. Instead, we should have kept this statute free from it and made sure that it concentrates only on making the government school function.
Thank you for your time, Professor, and thank you for your opinions.